The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to send a quick thank you to everyone, not only for joining, but for working with us as we pivot the content. Things are changing daily, hourly, and we really wanted to make sure that today's session focused on the most relevant content for retailers. So we ended up moving our fifth session up to today, and we invited Mark Weiss and Butch Blum for Management One to speak about renegotiating your lease. April 1st is coming right around the corner, and we had a lot of questions from folks on previous sessions about moving this session up. So we did a lot of research on our end here, and we want to make sure that you guys get extremely relevant content to use today. On that note, too, we're also going to be revising the content in our next session on Tuesday, April 2nd. We were going to be discussing financing and what are the options that retailers have available to them. And we're also in a holding pattern with retailers. As the government rolls out the $2 trillion stimulus package, we're going to keep our eyes on what they decide so that we can disseminate the information down to you and what the loan options are and everything that is available to you in that end. So on that note, I will definitely turn it over to Mark Weiss from Management One. I will say before that, sorry, Mark, if you guys do have questions at the end, please use the question function in GoToWebinar. We can get to your questions in an orderly fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. We're working every day to support our retail community. We have an interesting perspective of what's going on, and I invite you to continue to engage with us. When Butch retired after 43 years of being a successful retailer, I said, well, if you get too bored in your retirement, please call me. We'd love to have you join us, even and it can be at your own calling, whatever hours you want to put in. And after a few months, Butch joined us, and we're glad to have him. Sorry we need him for this. Sorry we're in this predicament, but Butch, after 43 years, has been through just about every storm imaginable in a business and found a way to navigate through it. So we're blessed to have his experience, his knowledge, his thoughtfulness. He's been a great mentor and coach to me and our affiliates and our company. And we also wanted to, there's a lot of webinars going on right now that I encourage you to listen to on rent negotiation. But the ones we've been following and listening to tend to be given by lawyers and real estate people. Our purpose here is to promote retail, independent specialty retail. So when we approach anything, our core purpose is the financial security of our retail community. And so our point of view and our direction towards this is for the benefit of the retailers. So again, I want to thank Butch and introduce you all to Butch Blum.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning, everybody, or at least it's morning where I am. As Mark said, my wife and I owned and operated a men's and women's apparel specialty store in downtown Seattle for over 42 years, and we were fortunate enough to sell our business in 2016. And Mark has brought me sort of out of semi-retirement. In case you're wondering, you're thinking to yourself, gosh, these are such unique circumstances, unique times. What does Butch bring to the table? So I thought I would, before we get into specific negotiation ideas, I'd bring a little history to it in terms of some of the things that we faced over our many years in retail. Our business opened in 1974, in 1979, and 1980. For those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a real estate crash. Banks were going sideways. Interest rates got up to 22%. And during that short time frame of about 18 to 24 months, our business was down on average about 25%. In 1987, probably many of you remember an event called Black Monday, October 19th, 1987. Stock market crashed, down 508 points, biggest loss, single day loss ever in the history of the market. Our business following that dropped 30 to 35% over the next few months, and was very challenging to say the least. Came out of it, moved through the 90s, relatively unscathed. And then there was this thing called the tech bubble burst, or some refer to it the dot-com crash in 1999, 2000. A lot of speculation going on in tech stocks, and all of a sudden the market dumped big time, and business was off 30 to 40% for the next couple of years. And then the subprime mortgage crisis occurred in late 2008, and it's now fondly referred to as the Great Recession. Business for the next 2 years was off a minimum of about 35%, and probably on average closer to 45 or 50%. And just again, to put it in perspective, to realize some of the things that we faced while all this was going on, in the late 1980s, our business was shut down twice, once for 2 weeks and one for 6 weeks, both as a result of ongoing construction adjacent to our building. They were building a high rise. As they were digging out the hole, our building shifted and moved into the space next door. And we were, as I said, shut down 2 different time frames, back-to-back summers. On top of that, in the mid-1990s, a pipe burst in the hallway behind our main building, our main space of retail, and our space flooded, and we were shut down as a result of that. During all of these times, all of the national crises, as well as what happened on a local basis, there were many, many nights where, honestly, I went to sleep or tried to go to sleep, not knowing if we'd be able to make the payroll the next day. And, honestly, I think the only thing that got us through all of these events were just, I guess, our attitude, the way we approached it, and just our survival instincts. I really am a strong believer in one's will. And I think that what you're facing right now is an incredible challenge, probably the likes of which we've never seen before. But I really, truly believe for the ones that are proactive, as necessarily as opposed to reactive, the ones that plan ahead and think about it and handle things in a very logical fashion, I think you will get through it, and there will be an end to it. And I do think that we will all come out stronger as a result. So today, now specifically, we're going to get into landlord negotiations. Nico, if you could pull up the first slide, please. I think for everybody concerned, probably who's listening in here, your rent is your single biggest expense on your income statement every year. Probably the only possible exceptions to something like that would be if you own your own building. And if you do, good for you for having the foresight, or your family for doing that a long time ago. So let us begin. The art of negotiation. I think that what you need to remember is it truly is an art, and you need to think that way because your landlord does this all day, every day, and they have really gotten it down to an exact science. They understand how to do it. They understand how to take advantage of retailers who aren't necessarily trained to do this. So you need to be very logical and methodical about how you go about this process. Slide 2, Nico, please. The sooner you begin this process, the better. Do not wait for your landlord to reach out to you. Understand you're not their only tenant. They're very busy right now in all sorts of negotiations. And as the saying goes, the squeaky wheel. I think you need to be the squeaky wheel, and you need to be proactive about reaching out to them and getting the ball rolling, because the sooner that you get the ball rolling, the sooner you will have resolution to your rent situation. And believe me, you will get it resolved, and you will like the results. Okay, slide 3, Nico. Okay, the importance of beginning the rent relief dialogue. Okay, there's different strategies that you can go about doing this depending upon your individual circumstances, because your situation is unique to yourself. It is different than any other retailer. You know, there's a lot of variables here that you need to consider, or that your landlord certainly will consider. So it's going to play into your negotiations. Number one, are you a long-time tenant who has been paying overages regularly? In other words, your rent percentages, and are you on time every month with your rent? You know, what are the terms of your existing lease? How long do you have left on that lease? Is there a personal guarantee on that lease? Is lease extension with better terms an option? Does the landlord have local ties to the community? Let's move on to the next slide, because that sort of transitions us, if you would, Nico. Okay. Remember that cash is king in any business, and you really need to focus on lowering your outlay as much as you possibly can, because most of you, I'm assuming, are closed, and for many of you, there's not much cash coming in. I do hear stories about very creative retailers and what they're doing to generate business, and good for you for doing that. But you know, it's probably not nearly what you normally bring in. So you need to mitigate this by making sure that your expenses are in line relative to what your sales are. Okay. As you're asking for this rent relief, you need to make sure that you're constantly reminding yourself, I can't get too emotional. I can't take this personally. If you make it personal, that's how it winds up being contentious. And the last thing in the world you want is that. You want to make sure that you are talking to and negotiating with your landlord on the same level that they are with you, because once again, remember that they are negotiating with several different tenants. You're not necessarily looking for what some other tenant just got. You're looking about the best possible outcome for your particular needs. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, Nika. Very interesting quote here. You know, and you know, as we bring this up, and I probably will mention this a couple times during the presentation, we are not lawyers. You know, if you have a lawyer, and as you get into discussions, you should talk to your lawyer and make sure you understand your lease completely. What we're doing is we're suggesting how to go about the negotiations, not what the legal ramifications might be. So let's talk a little bit now about why your landlord needs and wants you in their space. Okay? First of all, you're there. You're a proven quantity. You've already existed for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30, however long it's been. And they know that you're a proven product. They know that you pay your rent on time. They know that you're a solid citizen. They know that they can count on you. And if all of a sudden you're coming to them and saying, you know what, I can't pay rent. First of all, they're not going to be surprised. And secondly, you need to understand that, as the saying goes, the devil you know versus the one you don't. The last thing that they want is, especially in these times, is to have to go out and find a new tenant for their particular space. Understand that there's many costs that they're going to incur if for some reason that space goes dark and you go away. They have the cost of finding that new tenant, which is absolutely prohibitive. They have the downtime, where if you go away, how many months is it going to take to fill that space? Or they have no rent coming in at all. They're going to hire a broker. What percentage are they going to pay that broker to bring in a new tenant? That new tenant is going to require tenant improvements. How much is that going to cost them? $25 a foot? $50 a foot, maybe $100 a foot. So there's a lot of concrete costs that they're going to be incurring here. So believe me when I tell you that it is advantageous for them, and they are motivated to keep you in that space. Next slide, Nico. So here are a couple of the next two slides. Actually, if you can go down to the next one, Nico, you will see a couple of very well-known, prominent landlords that have quite a bit of mall space as well as downtown spaces throughout the country. Dan Gilbert, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, is probably this, singly responsible for the resurgence of urban Detroit. He did an amazing job, and he reached out. He was one of the first immediately to all of his tenants and said, hey, you've got free rent for now, I think it's for the next 60 days or something like that. And I think that's, incredibly generous and proactive on his part. What you need to do, and I don't mean to belittle what he's done here, is you need to understand what he's offering. And I think that, as Mark said earlier, we're trying to present it from a retailer's perspective. Most landlords, what they're going to do is they're going to try to give you free rent and then put that rent on at the back of your lease when you reopen. So we're going to get into that in a second, and we're going to talk a little bit about specific terminology and how you can apply it to your negotiations. So let's go to the next slide, Nico. Initiating the conversation. As I said earlier, landlords know what's going on. They're not going to be surprised to hear from you. It's essential that you get these discussions going as early as possible. I would suggest that you do it this afternoon, tomorrow, that you do not let it linger. There's a link available that you can click on. We've composed a letter, a template that you can use. Obviously, you're going to tweak that letter according to your own specific needs based upon whatever it is that you have going on with the landlord. It's not going to necessarily be the same letter as a friend of yours might use. Under normal circumstances, and I realize these are not normal circumstances, you're going to reach out to that landlord and you're going to set up a face-to-face meeting. With social distancing, that's something that we can't do right now. So probably you're going to reach out to them, I would say, either by phone call or email to set up a meeting. That meeting is either going to be on the phone, or if you're comfortable video conferencing, I would certainly encourage you to do a video conference. I think your landlord is going to be more sympathetic to you, to your needs, based upon being able to see you. I think there's no substitute for that. But as I said, if you can't do that, certainly a phone call would be appropriate as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide, Nico.
Will do. I just want to say to folks as well, it says link here on the screen. We are going to send you these slides as well as a video recording of this webinar. So please don't try to click the link right now on your screen. We're going to send it to you right after.
Great. Thanks, Nico. So the next slide, it talks about initiating the conversation. Something we want to interject here is, as I said earlier, each retailer has a unique set of circumstances. You all have your own leases, different than anybody else's, and your relationship with your landlord is different than everybody else's, and your history with them is different. So a question came up earlier today that was brought to our attention. If we have the same landlord, if we're part of the same, let's just say mall as an example, wouldn't we have strength in numbers by going to that particular landlord and all asking for the same thing? My response to that is, I understand strength in numbers, but I wouldn't necessarily go that route, particularly if you have a long, good standing relationship with your specific landlord. I would negotiate as good of a lease, renewal or renegotiation as I could based upon my relationship. What you don't want to do is you don't want to ride on someone else's coattails because you don't know what their coattails look like. I think it's imperative that you do best for your particular unique situation. Also, in these discussions, I think it's crucial that you remember as you're starting this dialogue that you're being as open-minded as you possibly can. And the only way that this is going to work for you is if it works for the landlord as well. So you need to understand that it's give and take, and you want to find some middle ground that you can live with. But as the saying goes, it needs to be a win-win situation. That's your ultimate goal. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, having the conversation, okay? You need to understand your lease. You need to understand what it says. This is where if you don't understand, you bring in someone, possibly an attorney, who can help you through this. Or, you know, as Nico will tell you, probably at the end, or Mark will tell you, we will be posting opportunities to reach out to us through our support team, and people like myself will be available to get back to you to help you understand certain clauses, certain facets of your lease that maybe aren't clear to you, or what the ramifications might be of a certain negotiation. So we're here to help you in any way possible, and it's absolutely critical that you do understand what your lease says. Under no circumstances do you want to get caught in a situation. A retailer said to me yesterday that they're going to just stop paying their rent on April 1st. And I said, so your landlord knows that, and you've discussed that with your landlord? And they said, oh, no, we're just going to not pay rent. And I said to this person, you can't do that. You know, you're going to create something that's going to come back at you, that's not going to be something you're going to enjoy. If you stop paying rent, make sure your landlord agrees to that and understand why it's happening. You need to be deliberate about everything you're doing. Be very thoughtful. Like I said, try to keep emotion out of it, keep as calm as possible, and make sure that you're documenting absolutely everything. You never know when a week later, a month later, or 6 months later, you know, as things start to get back to whatever the new normal is, that conversations might come up where you need to refer to something that you discussed a few months or a few weeks earlier. Make sure that is documented. And we'll get to specific documentation in a moment. Next slide, please. Okay. Understanding the negotiation. As I said earlier, all landlords, or I shouldn't do that, I'm generalizing, I apologize. Most landlords are going to try to get you to sign on for a rent deferral. You'll see the term abatement right there, rent abatement and deferral. What's the difference? A rent deferral basically means they're not forgiving the rent. All they're doing is saying, we'll give you a lower rent or free rent or whatever it might be for now, and you agree to a certain period of time. And at the end of that period of time, whatever rent you have deferred or not paid is added on to the rent that you owe starting day one of when you reopen. And that typically is going to be prorated over a period of time. I would very much encourage you to not get in that situation, even though your landlord is going to push you down that path. It really would put you potentially in an untenable situation 6 months or a year from now, as things do start to get better and we do start getting back to some degree of normalcy. You could wind up really choking on your rent because you have the rent as it is going to be then, plus whatever you owe from now. This is why I encourage you in your negotiations to ask for a rent abatement. It's not going to surprise your landlord, and during these times, they honestly expect it, and they will respect you for not just asking for it, but being insistent upon it in a nice way. And, you know, I believe in negotiations, you start from nothing and you work your way to the middle. So probably if it were me, I'd be asking for free rent, period, for the next foreseeable future. What does that mean? You know, maybe for the next 60 days or 90 days or something like that. Obviously, there could be a clause in there. If you reopen earlier than that time period, then rent would adjust accordingly. Now, when you say adjust accordingly, I like to think that your rent factor, your occupancy, is going to tie into your sales. So I happen to think that 5 to 6% is a pretty good rate right now. Some of you are probably paying more of a rent factor of even 7 or 8%. While sales are 0, or while they're much less than usual, I would try to get an agreement with them. If you can't get free rent, I would try to make it a percentage of sales. And as I said, I would do that while you are closed. And I would start it probably, if you're not going to start at free rent, I would start at 5%, and then you can go up from there. But I wouldn't want to get too much more than that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, understanding the negotiation. As I said, you want an abatement. You want that to be a controlled percentage. And by that, I mean you don't want it to exceed a certain amount. I'd like to keep it in that 5 to 6% range if it were me. And then what I'd also try to do is I would try to get that extended. And let's say that hypothetically this ends in 2 months, then I would try probably for 3, maybe to 6 months to get a different kind of an arrangement where maybe for that time period, months 3 to 6 or 4 to 6, you're operating under a straight percentage of sales. That way you're giving yourself a little bit of breathing room, because I happen to believe that when you do reopen, things aren't going to immediately go back to normal, and you're going to need some breathing room. So I would probably put a provision in this negotiation where they're giving you lesser terms than normal, different terms than normal, more favorable for at least 6 months, and maybe that graduates as time goes on, because that's what the landlord will want to do. And maybe at the end of the 6 months, then it goes back to the normal rent. Make sure that as this lease is rewritten and you agree to the terms with the landlord, that they're creating an amendment for your review, for your signature, for their signature, that you have on file. Every single lease amendment that was done in our renegotiations over our 40-odd years, I think we had 6 different lease amendments. You want to make sure that that is cast in stone, and that's not something that later they can come back to you and say, oh, no, that's not what we meant. Make sure that you have in writing exactly what they meant and what you meant by it. Let's see. Okay, next slide, please, Nico. If you're not going to pay rent, as I said earlier, be at least prepared to understand that certain expenses, certain taxes, certain occupancy taxes, depending upon if you have a triple net lease or not, are going to be still incurred. So that can be part of your negotiations, just as if you're paying a portion of your rent based upon percentage. But make sure, once again, this is spelled out very clearly, and that is communicated from both sides, so you're very clear and it is in writing exactly what it is that the new arrangement is. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is kind of wrapping things up. A quote from earlier, just remember one very important thing, and that is your landlord does this for a living. So make sure that you're not, put in a position where you don't understand what they're saying. Do your homework before you reach out to them. Understand your lease. Understand exactly what it is that they're asking of you. And if you don't understand, make sure that you're getting counsel so that you are able to proceed forward without any lack of knowledge or questions. So that concludes my portion of the presentation today. I'd like to thank all of you for listening to me. Hopefully I didn't drone on too long. At this point in time, I'm going to turn it over for Q&A, and I think Nico, who's already on the call, is going to take questions, or has been taking questions from the audience. Thanks again for your time, and good luck to all of you, and I will be on board to help in any way I can.
Thank you, Butch. Yeah, I also wanted to mention, if we don't get to the questions here, we did put our email address up on the screen, and I'm also putting it in the chat function as well. So feel free to reach out to us at support@managementone.com. We can send a direct line to Butch, and he can offer more detailed answers to some of your specific questions. For all of the folks asking if we're going to be sending the slideshow, absolutely. We're going to send a recording of the video and a slideshow as soon as we process the video. I did put a link to the lease letter also in the chat function, just so you guys can take a look at that right now. But let me get to a couple of specific questions that folks put out there. And I'm going to pose these to you here, Butch. One person asked, has anyone learned about the SBA relief package? It's said to cover your expenses while you're forced to close. I think that one might be a little early, but we are going to keep our fingers on the pulse of this, whatever the government decides to do. We are going to pivot our content for the webinar on Tuesday. But Butch, I don't know if you've heard anything in the last 24 hours that would be applicable to lease negotiations on that end.
Probably not. I think probably, again, I'm reading everything I can get my hands on and trying to stay as familiar with possible. I think the new stimulus package, first of all, it needs to be approved by the House. But even once that's done, I think everybody's going to spend an awful lot of time just sort of deciphering what it all means. So, I think that could be part and parcel of the negotiations. But I think for the most part, I think it is something that will be separate. And, I think it's going to have a lot more to do with employees and who have been let go and how they're compensated than it is necessarily with renegotiating the lease.
Yeah. I have about 2 or 3 different questions phrased differently, but they all basically say, how do we approach a landlord that basically says, look, I need to pay bills too, and they're coming almost like a brick wall, that they're not moving? What type of leverage do retailers have in that respect?
Obviously that's an excellent question, and I'm sure everybody's concerned about that. I think I go back to what I said earlier. The last thing in the world that any landlord wants is to see a space of theirs, let alone many spaces, go dark. And the leverage here is you. You are the proven quantity here. And, I never in negotiations like to threaten anybody. And I think over the many, many years that we renegotiated or just negotiated a new lease, there was only one time where somebody was really getting nasty and playing hardball. And I sort of responded in kind, and I regretted it later. That's why I keep talking about, try to keep it as unemotional as possible. Keep your cool about you, your wits about you. And for a landlord that just doesn't move, I think that you have to rely upon your wits in getting through to him and pointing out, and again, in a very calm fashion, what the repercussions might be. Because the threat of finding a new tenant that might have been real a few months ago or last year or a couple of years ago, I don't think that threat's going to work very well coming from a landlord for now. So I think you're dealing as a retailer, as a tenant, very much from a position of strength. So don't be afraid to exercise that strength in a very nice and calm fashion.
Right, and Butch, I just kind of want to add on to that. Don't go into a negotiating against yourself. And what that means is that sometimes you have to remember what it is that you want to get out of it, and as Butch said, be thoughtful about that. But don't start negotiating that the landlord's going to say this or the landlord may say that. That's what I mean negotiating against yourself. Don't lose your position because you think in your mind, and you're making things up in your mind, that this is how the landlord's going to respond. We have found that many landlords have already been extremely generous and kind and sensitive to the situations of many of our clients. So again, don't negotiate against yourself.
Yeah, Mark brings up an excellent point to everybody. And, you know, another way of looking at negotiating against yourself is, I always was taught negotiations to try to get the other party to move first. Your landlord's going to try to do that with you. And if they're sort of immovable in that regard, and they're absolutely requiring, you know, what is it that you want? What do you need? That's why I always say start from a position of zero. And, you know, just say, hey, I need free rent for the next 3 months. Period. That's it. You needn't say anything more. And then see how they respond. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, well, how about if you reduce our rent by 50% for the next 3 months? And what if the landlord was willing to give you 75%, or they were willing to give you free rent? Then you've already given up 25 or 50%. So you want to try to get them to budge first if you possibly can. And if they won't, ask for the moon. The worst they can say is no.
Yeah, I also think as you prepare, another point in preparation is to look at your options. What other spaces are available that might be as good or better than you currently have, or just slightly not as good? And talk to them and see what they would be willing to do, because a prospect is something that's valuable to somebody that doesn't have it. So I would definitely do my research so you know what the marketplace is willing to offer you for you to leave, especially if you've got a lease that's coming up. I would also say that you've got an opportunity to, this is an add-on to what Butch said also, ask for the moon. If the landlord says no, or in any negotiation, when somebody says no to the other side, that's just the first step to getting to a yes. So there's an old thing in selling that it takes 7 no's before you budge. And a lot of times people will say no on the first side. Remember, negotiation, the first one that blinks loses.
Yes, correct. And just as a specific example of what Mark was just talking about, you know, we had been in the same retail space for about 32 or 33 years, and our building sold, and plus our lease was coming up shortly thereafter for renewal. And we went to the new owners to try to extend our lease, and they were really trying to jack up our rent considerably. And this went on for quite a while, and I finally said to my wife, we need to look for another space. And she said, this is the last lease we're ever going to sign. We're not moving. And I said, can I at least go out and look? Long story short, we wound up finding a better space, a better location, about a block and a half from our old space. We wound up negotiating an incredible lease. The tenant improvements were abundant. It was a beautiful new space on a street corner, traffic going both ways off the freeway. Our first month after we moved was the biggest month we had ever had in our store history. So don't be afraid to hold that in your hip pocket as well. That always can be a point of negotiation. Again, you want to be dealing from strength. So Mark's right. See what's out there. Be familiar with your market.
Excellent. This one gets a little more technical. How does the strategy differ if I have month-to-month rent, or does it?
If you're comfortable with month-to-month rent, I don't think the strategy really changes that much. It would make me a little nervous. Personally, I would try to see if I could get something on a little bit longer term basis than that. But I think the strategy is still similar. The only problem is with month to month, you are losing a lot of your leverage. You know, again, something I didn't mention earlier in terms of your renegotiations, what you want to think about doing is you're discussing options. If you're going to get free rent or a significantly reduced rent, you might want to discuss with the landlord that I'm willing to extend my lease. We now have a 5-year lease. Can we talk about a 10-year lease? That's going to be very attractive to your landlord. That increases the value of their property. So that's something else that I would consider in your discussions or negotiations. But as far as month to month is concerned, no, I think the discussions are similar. I would just make sure that you understand you don't have nearly, as I said, the leverage that you would in a long-term lease.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add on to that. I think that if you're on month to month, given the financial opportunities through the SBA that are going to be available to the government, you're never going to see, hopefully, and again in your lifetime, money this inexpensive. So it's a great time to negotiate. It's a great time to extend if you're on month to month, if you want to stay in business, to extend the lease, as Butch mentioned, and with options, 3- and 5-year options. And if you sign an option, you have a better opportunity to get leasehold improvements on top of it. So it can turn out to be a good thing.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
This is a related question. Is there a different approach if I know I'm going to be moving in 6 months?
I'm assuming that the landlord doesn't know that you're going to be moving in 6 months. So I would probably not share that with them. That probably is not going to strengthen your position in negotiating the rent downward. So I would just negotiate the same way that we've been discussing. And who knows? Maybe the landlord is going to cut you such a good deal that maybe you might not want to move. But if you know you're going to be moving and it's already a signed, set in stone kind of deal, then all you're out to do today is to cut the best deal you can in the short term.
Excellent. Let's see here. I have one person saying, Butch, are you recommending that total occupancy costs should be in the 5 to 6% range, including CAM, etc., along with the rent?
No. CAM, all that kind of stuff is on top of that. So I'm talking about your base rent. And depending upon what city you're in, are you downtown or are you in a mall, you're going to add anywhere from, who knows, 1 to 2.5%, 3%. Some cities it's just really, really high. But definitely, even including CAM, your cost of doing business, your occupancy has got to stay in single digits. I don't think any retailer can afford to let that get north of 10%.
Okay. This is an interesting one. We actually had a client of ours reach out last night with a potential answer to this. Somebody says, what if you've never met your landlord? My landlord is basically absentee and we communicate with a management company. We had a client last night that gave us their success story. They reached out directly to the management company and within 1 hour, they got a response from the owner with rent reductions. So I'll let Butch speak more on this one, but I would definitely leverage the management company if that's your only outlet.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't be shy. Again, you don't know if you don't ask. And, sometimes these management companies are instructed to just deal with it, and maybe they've already been given parameters. Okay, you can give them a 25% rent reduction for a month or maybe for 2 or whatever, maybe 50%, and for people that are asking for more than that, they're just basically told to say no. Again, using a specific example, when we moved our space several years ago, and we're not intending to do it, the new owner of our building was based in New York, and we tried to reach out, and we're having no success. So we went through the management company and, basically said, we're looking at new spaces. We're seeing what's out there. We do not want to move. And it was amazing how quickly we got a response. So sometimes, not an idle threat, but just making them aware of your options and what it is that you're willing to do. Sometimes they just think that, oh, okay, it's our building, they're there, they're staying, and there's nothing they can do. Well, that's not true. As a retailer, you have options. So I love the story you just told, Nico. I think that's great. And I think too many retailers are a little bit reticent to maybe reach out in that way. And I think we all need to be prepared to do that.
Nico, I just got a text from a landlord, I guess who's listening in, and they said, as landlords, we're telling our tenants just to pay CAM, and their center is full, all of their tenants accepted.
Excellent.
Good for you, landlord. As long as you're not tacking it all on the back end.
Somebody's asking, what if you were able to pay rent for April? You're just not sure about the future, May, June, and on. So do you negotiate now or wait until next month? I'm assuming you want to start as early as possible, but what are your thoughts on that, Butch?
Oh, that's a really good question. And that's one that's good for that retailer for being in a position to be able to pay their rent for April. Yeah, I agree with you, Nico. I think they need to start negotiations now. And that money that they have for rent, if they can hold on to that, that might be far more valuable to them down the road, because none of us knows what lies in the future, how long this thing is going to go on. And I think whatever you can just do to conserve your funds and just be totally fiscally responsible, I think that's going to bode well for you down the road. So I wouldn't be too quick to let loose of that money, particularly when, I think you can probably negotiate whether it be free or close to free for now, and get it abated rather than deferred. Why give up that money if you don't have to?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's sound, and you use the word conserve. I would agree. I would use the word preserve cash. Cash is king, and the people who have it, when we get out of this, are going to not only win, but they're going to capture market share. Retail Dive last week predicted 15,000 retailers would be gone when this is all said and done. I don't know if that's where that number came from or if it's a true number, but for those people who have cash, you have lots of opportunities to do lots of things and capture market share. So to the extent that you can preserve cash and leverage your assets correctly now, plays into a longer term strategy for the success of your business.
Yeah, Mark, they actually pulled that number from a research study that was done by an industry firm. I can add that into our slides as well. That's a good reference to point out. Somebody's also asking, have you ever added to your leases that the landlord gets paid based on foot traffic? I would add in maybe other metrics as well. Is it wise to tie your lease to certain retail metrics?
I think there might be, in these times of electronics and technology that's available, I think leases in the future might be written a little bit differently. I would be a bit reluctant to tie it into foot traffic, mainly because everybody's conversion rate is so different. And some stores don't, they're looking more for a big sale, and they might not be converting that many people that are walking through their doors compared to another store that's looking for a far higher conversion rate. So I don't know, Mark might have an interesting perspective on that. I would be reluctant to tie into those metrics personally.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And it depends on the nature of your business and what your average unit per transaction is, and things change. We have a luxury retailer that went into a shopping center, and they built a successful business. And over the last 2 or 3 years, high-end luxury, two other high-end luxury retailers came in. They created great synergy, and it benefited the landlord. They're actually using that in their negotiations right now with the landlord. So it's foot traffic is a difficult metric to when you look for a place, you want to, there's a lot of elements that go into a decision for a location. So I agree with you, Butch.
And for anyone on the GoToWebinar software right now, I put the article Mark referenced in the chat function with the 15,000 stores. It's definitely worth a read from Retail Dive. One person is asking about personal guarantees in the lease. What if your lease has a personal guarantee? This particular person said if there's a default, they are personally responsible.
Yeah, many leases are going to be tied to personal guarantees. I always did my very, very best to not sign a personal guarantee, but from time to time, that was attached to our leases. It does put you in a more challenging position. Even with a personal guarantee, I think you're going to find most landlords are going to have sympathy and an openness and a willingness to discussions. And particularly if they have local ties to the community, the last thing in the world that they need is get bad press and to have a situation become public in the media where they, during times like this, were not willing to negotiate with a tenant, and the tenant was forced into whatever the situation is, giving up their home or some kind of voluntary bankruptcy or whatever the situation might be. So that's the last thing in the world a landlord needs or wants. And I guess specifically, my answer is, yeah, it does change the dynamics when a personal guarantee is involved. You know, you need to be aware of it, you need to understand about your legal obligations, but I don't know that it completely compromises your leverage here. I don't think it does.
And Butch, I think this is an example where you should negotiate against yourself. Just because you signed a personal guarantee doesn't mean you don't have rights to negotiate. And I would certainly exercise those rights and negotiate with the landlord. When you signed that personal guarantee, you did not know that there was the governor of your state shut down all your businesses. So I would say that in this instance, you're dealing with a pandemic that you didn't know was going to exist when you signed a personal guarantee. Things changed. So I would definitely talk to your attorney about that. I know that one of our clients' attorney is thinking of suing the state when this is all over, just because it's discriminatory against businesses that have closed. I mean, you can go to Target or Costco and buy groceries and buy apparel and buy jewelry and buy a flat screen TV. So they get to continue to conduct business, but small, special, independent specialty retailers that have had to close because of this pandemic have that opportunity. So it really isn't fair. And I think that these are the kinds of things that you want to bring out when you're having a discussion with your landlord if you signed a personal guarantee. Don't negotiate against yourself. This situation did not exist when you signed that agreement.
Yep, Mark is correct. Totally agree.
I do want to say one thing. We allotted this webinar for 45 minutes. We are a little bit over. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you do have to go somewhere, please feel free. We are going to send you the recording after. Butch, if you're okay to answer a few more, I'm happy to throw some more at you.
Yep, please. I'm here. Happy to do it.
Excellent. Let's see, we have one attendee. Their landlord says he has not been granted a mortgage payment reduction, so he can only offer a small abatement for 3 months if we pay all 3 months on time. What would be your response to that?
You know, I view that, Nico, as a starting point or a point of negotiation, and they are going to move off that. The question becomes, how far are they going to move off it? And, you know, is to his comment about, you know, he hasn't been offered any kind of a lowering of his mortgage. He's going to have remedies available to him. He's going to have opportunities to lower his payment, to lower the interest, to have certain things, probably more things available to him than you as a retailer will have. So I just view that as a way to negotiate. And I'd say, you know, I understand what you're saying, but, and you know, just put your case in there and talk about your needs, and they will move off their position. It's just, you know, like I said, if you have to make the first move and you ask for free rent, you know, some landlords will give you free rent, maybe not for 90 days, but maybe they'll give it to you for 60 or for 30. It's just a starting point, and that's the way I would view that.
Excellent. One of the folks asks, you mentioned in an earlier slide about rewriting the lease. So in future lease negotiations, should there be a store closings by act of God provision that requires rent abatement?
Oh, I like that question. Hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, I think that's a good one. You know, there's something called, I'm not an attorney, but there's something called force majeure, which I think is an act of God or something like that, that interferes your business. Yeah, I don't see a reason why you couldn't put that into your lease. I don't know that the landlord is going to offer that up, but you could have that written in if you want and talk to your attorney about that, and actually have a provision where under certain circumstances, pandemic, or I can't come up with an example other than that right away, but where you would be receiving a rent abatement during that time period. Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion.
I think after this crisis, it's not going to be uncommon for lawyers to see that come up.
Yeah, boy, I think you're right.
One person I think just needs a little more clarification when you were mentioning the 5% to 6%. And they're asking, so when you say 5% of sales, do you mean that this is what we should ask to pay for our rent? For example, if sales are $1,000, we would only pay $50. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yes. If the sales are $1,000, then my suggestion is 5% of that being $50. You know, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. You want to try to control all of your expenses as best you can. And if you can keep your rent factor, as somebody pointed out earlier, exclusive of your CAM charges, if you can keep it into the 5 to 6% range, and all of your other expenses are in line, then you have a very good chance to make money. It's difficult when I look at financial statements from any business, but retailers specifically, and I see that they're paying rent of 11, 12, even 14%. Your chances of making any money with your rent factor, your occupancy being that high, it's going to be tough to stay in the black as far as your bottom line is concerned. So yes, you are understanding that correctly.
Okay. One attendee is asking, has anyone had any luck with business interruption insurance discussions?
So I've talked to 2 retailers who have reached out to I've talked to 3 retailers who have reached out to their insurance agents, you know, and they've been sort of stonewalled, just saying absolutely not. This is not covered. I think there's going to be some interesting, you know, Mark mentioned a lawsuit that's going to possibly be presented. I think there's going to be some lawsuits against insurance companies. I mean, if all of a sudden they all came forward and said, yeah, come on, let's do it. You know, we're going to pay you for business interruption, it would put all the insurance companies out of business. So the last thing they want to do, you think about insurance and the premise from which they work, you know, and their whole thing is a waiting game. And if they can get you, just stall you long enough, and you just eventually get to a point where you're so frustrated, you go, oh, whatever, I'm just going to move on, then they win. So I think that there could wind up over the next year, 2, 3, I don't know, some test cases, and it could be very interesting to see. But again, they've got, you know, attorneys that they pay significant retainers to that are going to do their very best to keep you at bay. So I don't think it's going to be an easy thing to win. I think there might be some partial compensation down the road. And I think that, to your point earlier, I think that insurance policies, just like leases, might be written differently in the future to include, you know, situations like this. But for now, they're saying no, and I'm sure they're going to continue to say no as long as they can until somebody really goes after them and hopefully wins.
One person is asking, do we really even want to have the landlord know what our sales are?
It's pretty unusual nowadays that your landlord doesn't know. It sounds to me like this person that's asking is not on a percentage lease. Um, so if for some reason you don't want your landlord to know, and you're adamant about that, then you in your head could come up with a formula that without coming up with a percentage, you come up with an amount, and maybe in your head you're figuring out 5% of sales for the first month, and maybe then you bump up the month by X amount, and maybe you make it a month-to-month negotiation depending upon how things are going. It's going to be hard for you to keep it from them how much business you're doing, and they're going to push hard to find that out. But if you're, like I said, if you feel strongly and don't want to disclose that information, then maybe make it a number instead of a percentage.
Got it. One person is asking, when you say CAM, are you excluding real estate taxes? Their rent is broken
No.
down by 1, base rent, 2, CAM, and 3, taxes.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a good question. I think accountants do it differently, depending upon who you ask. And on some statements, you'll see real estate taxes in there with your CAM charges, and others you see it broken out. And when I said you got to keep things under, south of 10%, I'm including CAM charges and real estate taxes.
Okay.
I view all of that as an occupancy expenditure.
One retailer's in an interesting position. They say, due to CAM adjustments from 2019, I have 2.5 months of credit that usually goes towards rent. So how could that influence my position of strength in reworking the lease?
They have a 2.5% credit?
2.5 months of credit.
Oh, 2.5 months of credit. Just on the CAM charges, not on rent. Right?
No, it was adjustments from 2019, and it usually goes towards rent. And they were curious if that had any influence on their position of strength when they're reworking the lease.
I don't know that it really changes their position of strength. It just means they sort of have money going forward that they can use, which is nice. That's a good position to be in. I personally don't see a way that strengthens their negotiations. I think it just is kind of like found money. So, I don't know that it affects anything other than they just get to deduct that off their invoice next month.
Okay, and the final question here, I'm assuming the answer is no, because a lot of these strategies are pretty overarching, but they're asking, does it matter if the landlord is a mall, a building owner on a street, or a shopping center?
Not really. I mean, not really. A landlord is a landlord. There's some really great landlords out there. I mean, over our 40 plus years, we had one landlord for almost 30 years. And they were just so involved in our business. They supported our business. I don't think it really matters. I think that there's going to be great landlords in malls and downtown situations. And again, it gets back to your relationship with that specific landlord and their willingness to work with you. And it goes back to just having that open and honest dialogue and understand that they're in business too, that they need to make a living, that they need to survive. And, I just always firmly believe that there's a middle ground there that can work for both sides. And so you just need to go into it with that sort of attitude. But no, I don't think that it really matters where their property is located.
Excellent. Well, Butch, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to stay on a little bit extra and joining us this morning. That was a lot of fantastic info, very relevant to right now. Thanks to everyone that joined us this morning and provided questions. I wanted to remind everyone again that we are going to have a follow-up webinar on April 2nd, on Tuesday. We're going to invite Rich Rose to discuss anything and everything in regard to finances. We have a set agenda right now, but we are going to revise that tomorrow and over the weekend, probably on Monday as well, based on what the government does. So I strongly urge everyone to register. If you can't attend the live session, we are going to send out a recording as well. And if you have any follow-up questions that you didn't throw out here, go to the chat function again on GoToWebinar. We included the email address that you see on your screen now. We also included a link to the lease letter template in the chat function as well, but we're going to send you all some slides and a video recording later. And just know that Management One is here to answer your questions. So please fire off anything you have at support, and we will return an answer to you in a timely fashion. We're here for you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.